Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you all had a wonderful weekend. Sorry I wasn't able to get to doing the Sunday meta breakers that I usually do, and I'll try to make up next Sunday. And my schedule's getting a little busy these days, so I'm doing my best. So this week, though, we do have some nice decks to talk about, some new changes. So every Monday, what I like to do is my best of 1, best of 3 meta review for the current set in Standard, which is Bloomburrow. And so in week 3 here, we see the number 1 list according to Untapped, which is a third-party tracker, for Bronze to Mythic, is Mono Red Aggro. And if we compare this one to last week, we see very few changes to the archetype. We see dropping 1 Manifold Mouse to bring in an additional copy of the Demonic Ruckus. Otherwise, the deck is very similar. So the general plan is win by turn 3, maybe turn 4. So Slick Shot, Show Off, getting +2/+0 every time you play a spell. Manifold Mouse, being able to give a creature at the beginning of combat double strike or trample. A mouse specifically. So the Heartfire Hero can hit for a ton of damage, and then when it dies, it deals damage to your opponent. It's very similar to the Rakdos Prowess deck that I'll talk about here shortly, or the Rakdos Aggro deck, and basically you're lowering the chance of a turn 3 win for a little bit more consistency, because the weakness for this deck is single point interaction, destroying the target of your combat tricks. So if you're playing up against this deck, wait for them to use the Monstrous Rage, the Might of the Meek, the Demonic Ruckus, try to get a 2-for-1. And then they've got the Shock and the Lightning Strike, which the Rakdos Aggro deck doesn't usually have, which allows you to be better in the mirror match where you can then shoot your opponent's creatures. Number 2, according to the tracker, was Rakdos Aggro, and we finally see a little bit of changes coming from the list that I covered in week 0 that Magic Christian took to Mythic in 4.5 hours. And we've dropped the lands down to 18, which I felt like originally it felt like it was a little bit too high of a land count because of the Emberheart Challenger and the Blazing Crescendo giving you some dig, but a lot of times you're just trying to maximize the amount of turn 3 wins that you have. So Slick Shot, Show Off with 2 combat tricks that do at least 2 combat or 2 power increases the power to 9, and then you can sacrifice it with the Callous Sellsword to fling it, and it gets +2/+0 from the fling, so it deals 11 damage. So on turn 3, you can get a pretty consistent win with the Slick Shot, Show Off, as long as they don't have that single point interaction to blow it up. The other thing too is that Cacophony Scamp and Heartfire Hero both work really well with the Callous Sellsword, because if they get their damage through, you can then fling it afterwards to end up dealing 3 times its power in a single turn. So if you hit with a Monstrous Rage on your Heartfire Hero, you're looking at 15 damage just off of these 2 cards alone with the Heartfire Hero. So this deck can hit for it's very, very fast paced, and it's really kind of meta defining that this standard is going to be like aggro is looking to win by turn 3. That being said, though, it does struggle against the instant speed interaction of both like Shock and the Lightning Strike, or cut down and go for the throat. So it's definitely not unbeatable. Number 3, according to the tracker, was Selesnya Rabbits. And this is kind of replacing the Boros Convoke strategy before rotation, doing the go wide strategy. So we've got the Hop to It that makes a bunch of 1/1 tokens. You can then tap all of your creatures to convoke and use Knight Errant of Eos to dig for additional threats, which makes the deck resilient to the temporary lockdowns and the Sunfalls that everybody runs to then counter the go wide strategy. And it's particularly nice against the discard decks that are making you discard cards, because everything in this deck is giving you more than just 1 card, and discard's trying to answer you 1-for-1. So it's kind of a natural counter to a lot of the mono black strategies. And it's just a lot of rabbit synergies outside of that, cards that make your rabbits bigger, get bigger by how many creatures you have on the field. And then you've got the Sanguine Evangelist, which gives you the Battle Cry, giving your whole board the +1/+0. And then Warren Warleader is kind of replacing Adeline that we saw, that rotated out in August. And this one giving you 1/1s every time that you attack, or giving you a board pump and giving you that +1/+1. So this deck is pretty spicy right now in the meta, and I think of the two prowess decks and the Selesnya Rabbits are, I think, in a tier above the other best of one decks. Number 4, according to the tracker, is Mono Black Aggro, and this one is trying to answer your opponent's, like, the prowess decks really is like an anti-meta pick, because you've got the cut downs and the go for the throats to counter out the slick shot show-offs. This deck can struggle a little bit against the go wide, because a lot of your cards that answer 1-for-1 struggle with them going wide, but it does also put in a lot of pressure. So we can start on turn 1 with the Death Touch or the 1/1 Flyer, both of these being pretty good at pushing damage, which synergizes nicely with Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor, giving you the card draw. You have to pay life, but you can play the Shieldred to counteract that, so you're actually gaining life every time that you're damaging and drawing. Deep Cavern Bat is another evasive threat that works really nicely with Gix, Yawgmoth Praetor. We see 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism and Caustic Bronco, and the Lord Skitter Sewer King for a little bit of graveyard hate, which isn't as important as it was in the... it's not as important now that we've seen the more graveyard-centric strategies rotate, but there are a couple ones out there, like Golgari Roots is kind of lurking in, under the surface. So if I compare this to what I talked about in week 1, we see no changes to this archetype. So this one pretty close to, I think, what its final form is going to be. We've got the Virtue of Persistence, which gives us that life gain against aggro. Gix's Command is going to be our best card against the go-wide strategies of Selesnya Rabbits, being able to wrath the board. Number 5, according to the tracker, is Rakdos Lizards. And this one, if we compare it to last week, we see no changes to the archetype. So this one also kind of looking like at least its final form for now. And so it's a bunch of lizard synergies, which also happen to be outlaws. So you can, Laughing Jasper Flint can give you additional dig. And this deck digs really well because of the Fireglass Mentor being able to give you that card off the top if you've damaged them. And the Vine Lasher making it so that you can damage them just by even playing a land. You don't even have to be attacking them. The Hired Claw can get just out of control and dealing that 1 damage every time that a lizard attacks, so it can even just sit back as you're sending in other things if you need to trigger your 1 damage for cards like Gev and the Fireglass Mentor. Gev giving you that +1/+1 counter on things that you play. The Flamecash Gecko can really change the ramp. You know, if you're playing out something that can damage them on turn 1, on turn 2 you can then play 2/2 drops, and that can be really backbreaking for your opponent. And then it also has the Cut Down and the Go for the Throat, which helps against the mono red prowess builds. And then it has the Scales of Shale, which really help in the mirror match. Trading blows, the lifelink can be quite handy. Number 6 is Boros Convoke. And we've seen this was the archetype that was speculated to do, I think, the best post-rotation of the previous archetypes outside of the new ones, because it did not lose that many tools. The Voldaren Epicure does hurt the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, this being kind of a combo deck where you're trying to get this out as quickly as possible, because it came in with a creature and spawned a map token. And we've seen people exploring like the Jess Sky space and bringing in blue so that we can run the Spyglass Siren that also gives you that map token to kind of replace the Voldaren Epicure. But I like where this landed, so we're not running the full playset of the Ocean Frontliner, and instead we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Hop to It. Was wondering if we were going to see some crossover between the Selesnya Rabbits and see if this card slotted into Boros Convoke. And to make room for this, what we've done is we've dropped the 2 Yoshin Frontliners, we've brought the Sanguine Evangelist up to 4 copies, we've dropped the 3 copies of the War Leader's Call, which is the one that gives everything +1/+1 and then pings your opponent for 1 damage every time something enters the battlefield. It's particularly good against the control meta, which we're not seeing as much of because of Wandering Emperor and Memory Deluge going away. It's been struggling a little bit, not to mention because of the lack of the slow lands, everybody's running the Cavern of Souls for fixing, which then makes the counterspells just kind of not as good, right? So the deck still being able to hit a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos off of the Novice Inspector, Gleeful Demolition, blowing up the map token to give you the 3, and then playing one other creature. The Resolute Reinforcements can also give you a pretty consistent turn 3, along with the hop to it, if you do miss the turn 2 Knight Errant Vios. And then you're giving everything the board pump off of the Imidane's Recruiter or the battle cry off of the Sanguine Evangelist. And then in case of the Gateway Express is really like your one piece of interaction. You're going to be using this for some problematic threat to get over, and then also gives you that +1/+0 permanently if you're able to attack with 3 or more creatures in a single turn, which this deck does really well. We also did see some changes to the lands, so we dropped a Plains and a Mountain to bring in 2 more Cavern of Souls. 7, according to the tracker, is Mono Black Skeletons, and we've seen this one kind of going through iterations in week 1 and in week 2. So this one I don't think is in its final form, but we do, the core is really there, right? And part of the reason why I talk about the changes throughout the weeks is that if the card is being added in or if the card is being removed, you can kind of consider that part of the flex spots, while the rest of the deck, if the cards aren't moving around, then they're probably more core to how the deck actually functions. So this week we see that we've dropped the 1 copy of the Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket, it being one of the weaker of the other skeleton options because of the 1 power. And dropped the 2 copies of the Vadmir New Blood, which was benefits off of the crime synergies, and also lowered the curve. So we've got rid of the Shieldred the Apocalypse, we got rid of the Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal, and we've gotten rid of Gisa, which started out at 4 copies, went down to 1, and now is gone entirely. So depending on the speed of the format, Gisa can struggle a little bit against the Sunfalls in Control, but then also as a 5-drop, it can just be too slow depending on the pace of the set. And as more people are playing the Mono Red Aggro and the Rakdos Prowess, it's a pretty fast-paced meta in my experience. So I do like the changes though. So they brought in 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, and the Gix bringing that up all the way to 4 copies. So Deep Cavern Bat, again, being a good one to synergize with the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, because it's an evasive threat, is likely to give you that card draw as well as removing something from your opponent's hand. And they don't really want to block any of your skeletons because of the value of them just coming back, right? So they'll block it if it's free, but if they have to trade, then that's good for you. And so that makes it pretty easy to push damage with Gix. And then I like this edition, so bringing in the 4 copies of the Bloodletter of Akhlazot's. And actually, I think if we go back, if I look back in my notes, like months and months and months ago, somebody was talking about running Mono Black Skeletons with the Bloodletter of Akhlazot's, which Bloodletter used to be its own archetype, trying to go off of the Rush of Dread 1-turn kill and playing it more like a combo deck. But this works really well in aggro decks, being able to just basically double the damage that you're doing with your hasted skeletons off of Corpses of the Lost. And then similar to the other black decks that we saw, we are running the Cut Down and the Go for the Throat to counter the Mono Red Prowess. And then we have Case of the Stashed Skeleton, which also gives us another skeleton, and also a tutor effect to go find another like Bloodletter of Akhlazot's, because these cards do stack, right? So if you have 1 in play, it's 2. If you have 2 in play, it's 4. If you have 3 in play, it's 8. Right? So it gets like out of control if you can have multiples of these in the on the field. And since we're lowering the curve, we've dropped the lands down to 21. So we dropped the Hidden Necropolis, which is the tap land that can then be sacrificed to discover, kind of giving you some late game value. We dropped the 2 copies of the Sandstorm Verge, which is a way to kind of recur the crimes over and over. We dropped the 2 copies of the Volatile Fault, which is a way to another way to trigger a crime, more important when you have Gisa and Vadmir New Blood in your deck. And so it's like a cheaper demolition field and gives you in treasure instead of searching your library for a basic card, if I remember correctly. And then bringing the Swamp up to 21, so just 21 basics. And number 8, according to Untapped, is Boros Mice, and we've seen this one kind of flirting around with being in the top 8, but not really making it each week. But it did squeak into the last slot this week. And so this one is another aggressive deck. I think it plays a little bit worse than the tracker agrees, right? It plays worse than the Mono Red Aggro deck and the Rakdos Aggro deck, because the Rakdos Aggro deck is basically Mono Red Prowess. you don't need the black mana to be able to play the Callous Sellsword, because you're just playing it for the fling. So this one has a little bit less consistencies because of bringing in the second color, right? But it's, you know, it's got that sweet mouse synergy. So we've got the cheeky house mouse, we've got the Flowerfoot Swordmaster, the Heartfire Hero, the Raging Battle Mouse, the Manifold Mouse, the Emberheart Challenger, and then Mabel, heir to Cragflame. And this looks close to the deck that I was speculating would make it into a top archetype for Boros Mice. So I'm glad to see it here in the top 8. And Might of the Meek working really well, like the Ancestral Anger that rotated out, gives you that card draw as well as giving you trample. So works really well as long as you have it, especially if you have the mouse synergies. I've seen it being explored in other decks that don't even have the that many mice, just because of being able to trigger the prowess quite cheaply. And Rabid Gnaw has been a very impressive removal, being able to give that creature the +1/+0 and then having it deal damage to something else can make you 2 for 1 or 2 for 2 in unexpected ways. And the Monstrous Rage probably being Red's best combat trick. And the rest of this is then just the fixing. We do have the Rock Face Village, which can give our mice haste. And we also have the Lupine or Lupin Flower Village, which can then help us dig for additional stuff if we need to extend into the mid game. All right, that was it for best of 1. Now, the other thing that I like to do is cover best of 3. And for best of 3, I like to use the Standard Challenge tournament on Magic the Gathering Online. We always see a lot of top competitors in that tournament. And to start things off here, we've got Dimir Midrange by Mogged. And if you follow Magic tournaments at all, then you know who Mogged is. But this deck has been around before rotation, but we haven't seen it for a little bit. It kind of took it tends to take a sideline, and I'm not exactly sure why. It might be because of matchups being unfavorable, but it has an aggressive start, especially for best of 3, where there isn't the best of 1 hand smoother, which usually makes the aggro decks kind of extend a little bit more towards mid-range if you're comparing it to best of 1. So if you are coming to Arena for the first time and looking to replicate your experiences in paper, you're probably going to enjoy best of 3 more than best of 1 because it doesn't have that function that was developed by Ryan Spain. I think it actually is kind of fun, but it does favor aggro. So that being said, best of 3 doesn't have it, plays a lot more like paper, and that's what you're going to see in the Pro Tours anyway. So enough of that. So this is a new archetype, took down first place. It also took down 2 other top 3 spots this week. So 3 out of 9 of the top 3 spots this weekend were Dimir Midrange. So this deck is definitely here to, to shine again. And we see a couple of cards that haven't seen for a little bit, like the Shoot the Sheriff from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, the Phantom Interference instead of the Make Disappear, and still largely the same strategy, which is leaning off of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor with our evasive flyers like Spyglass Siren, the Deep Cavern Bat, and Fairy Mastermind. Also see Malcolm. We've seen this one kind of depends on the control situation. This one's more matchup dependent on whether or not Malcolm is a good inclusion. And then Plume-Creed Escort we got in Bloomburrow. Maybe we're going to see more of these. I think this is kind of a way to test how good it is, being able to negate your opponent's single point interaction at instant speed. A lot of this deck is playing your early threats and then leaving mana up to then interact and disrupt your opponent's plan. Liliana of the Veil then helping against the control matchup by making them discard. Shieldred the Apocalypse helping against the aggression or aggro strategies by giving us that life stabilization if we make it to 4. And then we have the interaction of Fairy Mastermind and Urtai Resurrected, which work really nicely together because Urtai Resurrected makes your opponent draw a card if you counterspell or destroy a creature or planeswalker. And then as long as you're flashing this in, then the Fairy Mastermind is going to trigger a draw and kind of offset that handicap. You both end up drawing cards. And then we've got Gix's Command. Because of how Boros Convoke was positioned before the rotation, I think there was a lot of hate that we saw in week 1 and week 2 that was directed towards Boros Convoke. I I think this week we see a decrease in that hate towards Boros Convoke, and then simultaneously, as we're going to cover here in a bit, we see Boros Convoke actually make it into the top 3. So it's still, Boros Convoke is still there. It's nice to have some sort of sweeper to answer the go wide strategies. As far as the toolkit in the sideboard, we've got Cut Down if we're up against like Gruul Aggro, Mono Red Aggro, Duress against the control decks. Disdainful Stroke works really well against Domain, being able to counter the Sunfall as well as the Traxa. Negate again for the spell-heavy control decks. Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal is best probably in the mirror match or against other aggro decks. Negate, we already covered that one. Shieldred's Edict then gives you some Planeswalker hate. I think that would be the most likely time that you're going to bring in that card. Glistening Deluge helps amp the amount of against the go wide strategies, so you can try to get a one-sided board wipe with this. Same Malicious Eclipse doing a similar thing to the Glistening Deluge, but then it exiles instead. So we've got the 3 sweepers. Second copy of Gix's Command, again, if the matchup is favorable, I'm going to bring that one in. And then the Harvester of Misery. So we still have a lot of tools against Boros Convoke, but not starting it in the main, bringing it into the sideboard, and then bringing it in when we are in that matchup. Second place on Saturday was taken down by Mono White Token Control by Tulio Jotti. And this one's also a new archetype, so that's partly why I love best of 3, is that you generally see more innovation in best of 3, and then it filters down into best of 1 over time once people start playing the best of 3 decks, right? So this one is taking a different twist on it. So last week I was talking about the Boros Tokens deck that was performing quite well in the Standard Open that happened in Japan, took down first place. I did a gameplay video of it, and it's a very impressive deck in best of 1. This one, ditching the Urabrask's Forward combination with the Caretaker's Talent, so the Caretaker's Talent draws you a card every time a token comes into play, works really nicely with the Urabrask's Forge, and this one's still going more towards a mono-white. Technically, it's not strictly mono-white because we do have 1 copy of Imidane's Recruiter to be able to give everything haste. But we still have a general theme here of control, so we've got a lot of the board wipes, like the Eternal Wanderer, being able to blow everything up. We've got the White Sun's Twilight, which also works as a Wrath. We've got the Lay Down Arms and Get Lost for our interaction. Archangel Elspeth is a really great way to create tokens. The Virtue of Loyalty creates the 2/2 token and then pumps your board at the end of turn. Beza giving us a nice target here that pairs, I think, really nicely with the Eternal Wanderer, because then you can exile Beza and then have it come back into play and re-trigger its ETB, gaining you life. And I've been encouraging people to explore more of this interaction specifically, and so glad to see it here. And then we've got Lauren of the Third Path to hate on like Urabrask's Forge, and Enchantment hate as well. Other Caretaker's Talents. We've also got the Fortune Loyal Steed, which is another way that we can kind of bounce our interesting ETBs. The Frontier Seeker helps us kind of with the mana smoothing, making sure that we don't stumble on lands. And then we've also got the Novice Inspector, which are both really decent targets to bounce if we don't have our Beza. So somewhere between a token value deck and then control. It's an interesting deck. And this one also I think is really worth keeping your eye on, because Tulio was able to take it to second place on Saturday, but then also took it to first place on Sunday. So the sideboard, we've got the Sunder the Gateway as the artifact or enchantment choice, the Disenchant, if you will. Lauren of the Third Path also giving us another Disenchant, so I think hating on that Boros Tokens deck that I was talking about, we're going to see more enchantment and artifact hate, I think, in this set than we haven't seen than we've seen in other previous metas. Esper Midrange required a lot of enchantment hate, but not specifically artifact, so we're kind of seeing a mix of the two this time around. Temporary Lockdown, again for Boros Convoke or some go wide strategies. Boonbringer Valkyrie to help stabilize against the early aggression by being able to give something the lifelink. Destroy Evil is that enchantment hate that was really good against Esper Midrange, but lacks the ability to affect artifacts, but works well against decks that have a target that has a toughness 4 or greater. So like Boros Convoke has the Knight Errant of Eos, for example. Golgari Midrange has Shieldred, etc. Stone Brain is kind of like a pithing needle. It's a way to be able to get rid of a specific strategy. So if your opponent has a key card that they can't win without, right? Like being able to take out the Caretaker's Talent from Boros tokens or the Urabrask's Forge. Some decks have very few win cons if they're very control heavy. So being able to even like take out an Atraxa and Domain, for example, can really help in certain matchups. The Tokashi's Welcome is kind of for the mid-range value, where if you're so the 3 mana, the enchantments that don't immediately affect the board are dangerous to play against aggro decks, where you need to be developing the board so you don't get overrun. When you're playing a value game, though, then Tokashi's Welcome helps ensure that you are drawing more than your opponent, and then being able to answer your opponent 1 for 1, and eventually win the game. And then we have 2 copies of Sunfall if we're up against something that's particularly good at rebuilding against the Wrath, or if we want the Exile effect instead of the White Sun's Twilight. All right, third place was taken down by Gruul Aggro by HirataZ, and if we compare this one to week 1, we do see quite a few changes happening to this Gruul Aggro archetype. So we've ditched the Fugitive Codebreaker, which is the 2/1 prowess that can give you additional dig with morph for whatever disguise. We dropped 2 copies of the Questing Druid. Usually we see this run at a full playset of 4. And we also dropped the 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off, so moving a little bit away from the Gruul Prowess build and more towards a traditional Gruul Aggro build. And instead of the Picnic Ruiner, which was the one that gave you the double strike, we're running the Manifold Mouse, which then can kind of give us that double strike on our Emberheart Challenger Heartfire hero. Then that's it for the creatures. As far as the non-creatures go, we've dropped the 2 copies of the Audacity, which is the enchantment that gives us the +2/+0 and trample, and we've dropped the 4 copies of the Royal Treatment, and instead we're bringing in the Snakeskin Veil. We dropped the 4 copies of Shock, so not going with the direct damage or the direct interaction, and instead we're running the hard-hitting Question as a way to cheaply, but more green than red, interact with our opponent, although it's sorcery speed and not an instant. But yeah, the Snakeskin Veil instead of the Royal Treatment being... I think there's pros and cons in both, right? This one, I think that I like the Snakeskin Veil a little bit more than the Royal Treatment personally, just because of the ward later can be nice. I think most of the time you just need to save your target once, but that's basically the difference between the two. 1 copy of the Witchstalker's Frenzy here to blow up a problematic threat. One copy of Warsqueak, which you remove a blocker while also giving something +1/+1 and haste. And we've also got 3 copies of the Demonic Ruckus. This one helps up against the like Boros Convoke go wide strategy that can kind of block your early threats. Sometimes like even just a 1/1 flyer can prevent you from getting the damage through with like Slickshot Show-Off, which this deck's not running. But the Demonic Ruckus still being able to give you that, get your double strike through and get around your opponent's blockers. We've also got the Innkeeper's Talent, which I think makes a lot of sense in this deck, being able to kind of trigger the Valiant of your mice, as well as just giving you that alternative win condition where you can kind of grind out a little bit longer. And to make room for this, we've dropped a mountain and sorry. To make room for this, we cut all those creatures. The lands also changed. We dropped a mountain and 4 Thran portals to bring in 2 Restless Ridge lines and 4 Rockface villages. So the Rockface being the one that gives the mice, raccoons, lizards, otters +1/+0 and haste, and the Restless Ridge line being the tapland for Gruul. This, I think, Thran portal I kind of like because it plays like a fast land where you're being able to play it early on untapped at the price of life. So it's kind of like having more of the Copperline Gorges and the Carplusian Forests. Some people absolutely hate Thran Portal, and I get it. It really depends on how much you're expecting to come up against other aggro decks. But really curious to see how the tap land plays with the Restless Ridgeline. It also gives the deck an alternative win condition if you are playing up against something that has a lot of answers for the creatures. So the sideboard, we also see a rework. So we dropped the Witchstalker Frenzy from the sideboard into the main, at least 1 copy. We dropped 2 copies of Koth the Fire Resistance, so that's gone entirely. We dropped the 3 copies of the Teutonic Hazard, and so that's the another signal here that Boros Convoke was not being teched as heavily against, or not as expected in the tournaments. And we've ran 4 copies of Pick Your Poison. I think this really has to do with last week. We saw a lot of Domain in the top 3, and this is a card that's pretty good against it because you're able to destroy the Beanstalk. You're able to destroy Atraxa, and so you're going to bring that in during that matchup for sure. Also see 2 additional copies of the Obliterating Bolt, being able to give you some exile, and then 2 copies of the Case of the Crimson Pulse, giving you additional dig if you need to extend the threat from, if you need to slow the pace down but extend it into the mid game, then you're going to bring in the Case of the Crimson Pulse. And we've also see a full playset of the Urbrask's Forge. So if your opponent is in colors that struggle with artifact hate, aka black, then you're going to bring in the Urbrask's Forge. All right, and because people have been teching less against Boros Convoke, we see a first place position taken down by Sapoa. And so this is the first time that we've seen Boros Convoke make it into the top 3 in the Bloomburrow meta. And so when I say this is a new archetype, it's not. This was been a top performer prior to rotation. In case you're returning to Magic and you don't know this deck, kind of like best of 1, I covered it already. We're shooting to try to maximize that turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos and then do the pump. We do see, again here, not running the War Leader's Call, which was a popular pick against all of the Azorius control that was in the pre-rotation meta. We do see the Tokashi's Welcome come in here to kind of extend a little bit against the, to give us a little bit more mid-range. And otherwise, very similar list. Get Lost works really nicely for the temporary lockdown, which some opponents will be running to counter this deck. So especially against the post-board game against White, expect to use your Get Losts on temporary lockdowns. And as far as the sideboard goes in, so you're going to want to bring in the 2 copies of the Get Lost. Invasion of Gobakon. So this one, some people run it to punish wraths that don't exile, right? So like if you're able to give everything indestructible, then it gets around the White Sun Twilight, it gets around the Starfall Invocation, it doesn't get around Sunfall, right? Personally, I think this card actually works better at disrupting tempo. So like I would bring it in against anything that has a turn 3 play that you're really trying to interrupt and stop, right? Like my favorite one before the rotation was to bring this in against Esper Midrange to delay my opponent playing Rafine, right? I think that's where this card really shines. Some people would disagree with that statement though, so take it with a grain of salt. We've got Lightning Helix against the Gruul Aggro and early aggro decks where we can gain some life gain. We've got the Elspeth Smite too, which helps against like mono red. One of the deck's weaknesses is against the aggro, against the early aggression. Requisition Raid giving us artifact and enchantment hate while also being able to pump our board for a +1/+1. Going to bring this in if you want to disenchant, like against Boros tokens. And we've got 3 copies of Urbrask's Forge. If they're really great at wiping the board over and over, they, again, like Black Wraths, like Deadly Cover-Up, then Urbrask's Forge you're going to bring in against the matchups that struggle against the artifact side of things. Second place was taken down by a Domain by Nick987321. And I apologize for this glitched out graphic. I hope Wizards of the Coast fixes that soon. The card behind the giant yellow square is Archangel of Wrath. And so if we compare this one to last week, which we had a lot of Domain, I'll cover it, compare it to the first version that I covered. We can see that this one is running the full 4 copies of Archangel of Wrath. And to make room for it, we're dropping the one Nissa Ascended Animist, which is the Planeswalker that can give everything the Overwhelm or Overrun effect, +1/+1 for each force you have, and Trample. So this deck, I think, again, surprising a lot of people. We all thought it was going to be gone with the Triomes rotating, and it has actually performed quite well. And as far as the general strategy goes, in case you're returning and new, the game is basically win off of herd migration, Atraxa for incredible amounts of value, and then Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall for any of the board-centric strategies, right? So Domain was kind of the reason why Golgari Midrange did not do particularly well. I thought Golgari Midrange was getting a lot of tools with Black in Bloomburrow, and I thought it was going to be its time to shine, but because there's so much Domain, then that is not great. The other thing too is that Domain kind of struggled against Azorius Control, and Azorius Control has not been doing as well since it lost Memory Deluge and the Wandering Emperor. So I think Domain is relatively well positioned in the meta, surprisingly, and functions perfectly fine off of the dual lands, like the Lush Portico, the what's another example? The Hedge Maze, any of those that have the basic land types, and yeah, so not a whole lot of things going on in there. Domain's been figured out for quite some time. I think the Heaped Harvest over the Cornucopia is here to stay. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, we see that the Archangel of Wrath that was in the sideboard got moved into the main. We got 1 less Get Lost and 1 less Negate, so just running 3 instead of 4 negates. And we brought in 2 copies of the Elspeth Smite to help against the Dimir Midrange and Mono Red Aggro, Gruul Aggro decks, and moved Nissa Ascended Animist from the main to the sideboard. So I don't want to cover everything in every detail every week again, but if you are returning, the Obstinate Baloth is particularly nice against Golgari Midrange as well, because of being able to counter Liliana, making you discard. And the Tranquil Frillback being well positioned for the Artifact and Enchantment Hate, while also giving you the life stabilization against aggro. So then on Sunday, we saw first place was taken down by Tulio Jodi with that mono-white token control deck that I talked about during Saturday's winners. Second place was taken down by Dimir Midrange by Gasman48 and was the exact same list as Mogged. I think I forgot to mention the Dimir Midrange by John1111 took down third place on Saturday in the second tournament, and that was also the same list as Mogged. So that's why I was saying at the beginning, those two looking particularly strong in this week 3. Now, the last deck that I will cover for my review here is Gruul Aggro, by O. Daniel Akos, another very familiar name. And so this one has enough changes compared to the other one. They're kind of fun to compare to the list that I had in week 1 and the 2 that made it into the top 3 this week. They're doing similar things, but not exactly. So we dropped 1 copy of the Monastery Swiftspear, and we dropped 2 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker, so both deciding to do that. Questing Druid also going down by 2, which the other list did as well. So I'm not exactly sure why the Questing Druid is not running as a full playset like we've seen in the past, but that seems to be the what's happening. So if you know in the comments below why the Questing Druid's getting dropped down, maybe it's just the pace is, you don't have the time to take the turn off to draw into additional value. But this one deciding to keep some of the Slickshot Show Off, not dropping it entirely, just dropping it down to 2 copies, and bringing in the Pop Hatch Recruit. And I like this one because if you don't have the Snakeskin Veil to save your stuff from your opponent's interaction, then you at least get a +1/+1 counter that you can move on to something else on your team, right? So I like the Pop Hatch Recruit, and I wonder if we're going to see more of this card. 3 copies of the Manifold Mouse to then have the mouse synergies for the double strike win. This one also dropping the Audacities and the Royal Treatments, and not dropping the full playset of Shock, but bringing it down to 2. Running the Snakeskin Veil over the Royal Treatment, and 3 copies as well. 3 copies of the Demonic Ruckus to get around the problematic blockers, and the 3 copies of the Innkeeper's Talent to then also be building your board. And as far as the lands go, we also see the Mountain and the Thrown Portal being dropped for the 2 Restless Ridgelines and the Rockface Village. So very similar, increasing the total amount of lands, same lands as the other deck. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they brought in 1 additional Obliterating Bolt instead of 2. Did bring it in the 4 Pick Your Poison. Again, I think that's largely because of Domain. Bringing in the Urbrask's Forge up to 4 as well. Again, that one demanding that the meta is going to bring in more artifact and enchantment hate. I do think we're seeing it, though, just looking at the sideboards this week. I think that next week, like Urbrask's Forge might not be as well positioned. Time will tell. We've also got the 4th copy of the Snakeskin Veil. If we do want to bring it in against a heavy single point interaction deck like Mono Black, Golgari Midrange, then maybe we bring in the other Snakeskin Veil. And then we have the Scorching Shot, which is kind of like the Witchstalker Frenzy, but then not as board dependent on making sure you have the creatures to be able to remove a problematic blocker like Sheoldred the Apocalypse. And the cards that we're getting rid of are the Tectonic Hazard. Again, this one being good against Boros Convoke. This O'Daniel Akos not deciding to drop all of them, instead just drop it down to 2. And we're dropping the 3 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, again leaning more on the Scorching Shot. And then also, like the list that I covered earlier, dropping the 2 copies of Koth, Fire of Resistance, which works better against the control decks that are good at wiping out the creatures with the Wraths, but not as good at affecting the Planeswalkers. So, with that concludes the Week 3 Best of 1, Best of 3 meta review. And I hope you guys have all been enjoying the Bloomburrow experience as much as I have. And I will be on tomorrow to talk about the community deck techs and your guys' submissions, give you some of my thoughts on the builds and whatnot. So if you're new here, welcome to my community. Remember to click like and subscribe. Consider joining as a member if you want to help support me financially. Would appreciate that. And throughout the week, I'll probably be posting some gameplay videos if I can get around to it. There won't be a poll this week. Again, I'll try my best to get it set up next weekend, but my schedule's changing a lot because of a new job, and so trying to make my little hobby work on the side, right? So take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and I will catch you all tomorrow.